right, so today we're going over chapter, the chapter, I think 3 of Ocampo and Menzel. Now the class will go over the contemporary Asian American history of migration and immigration. Any class member can read the first one. Number 1, Japanese.
All right, I'll take it. The who, mostly men and farmers. The what? Japanese Americans originally came to the U.S. in search of peace, prosperity, and agriculture. To do so, they left their unstable homes and became part of the tough working class in order to have a chance to provide for their children with a better future. Yet, when they arrived, they first had to deal with the hostile neighbors, harsh working conditions, and laws that put their very livelihood in America at risk. The where. They first arrived in the Hawaiian Islands, to work on sugarcane fields, later settled in other states like California, Washington, Oregon, to become farmers and fishermen. When? In 1860s, Japanese immigrants first arrived on Hawaiian Islands between 1886 and 1911. More than 400,000 men and women came to the U.S. How? About 85,000 Japanese immigrants arrived at Angels Island in San Francisco, California, through boats, which was a federal government immigration reception center in the 1920s where they would be inspected medically and physically. Another reason is that Japanese immigrants were allowed to travel to the U.S. due to a treaty between Japan and the U.S., which was the Gentleman's Act, which the Gentleman's Act was an effort by President Theodore Roosevelt to calm growing tensions between the two countries. And also, in 1908, a labor shortage has resulted in anti-immigration laws, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which made it illegal for Chinese immigrants to become U.S. citizens. In return, this opened doors for the Japanese workers to find jobs and replace the previous labors held by the Chinese workers, like railroad, logging, mining, and fishing, to name a few. These jobs were low-paying and dangerous. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Chinese. Thank you, Chair.
I guess I'll speak for group 2. So we had Chinese. For who? Mostly Chinese men, according to the U.S. Census. As of 2010, 23.2% of Chinese are here in the U.S. But it's mostly Chinese men who migrated early on. And for what? We have Chinese immigrants who came to the U.S. in the beginning were poor, so they immigrated for more opportunities to make money so they can bring back to their homes. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, however, restricted Chinese immigrants from entering the country until 1943 when Congress nullified the act. Where in California, which led to ethnic enclaves like Chinatown, the states west of the Rocky Mountains, which are the areas where we have the most habitants to have Chinatowns and such that have popped up. And let's see, when at first only a handful of Chinese came, mainly as merchants, former sailors to America. The first Chinese people of this wave arrived in the United States around 1815. And for how they got here, the immigrants undertook a Pacific Ocean journey of 3 weeks by ship during the California Gold Rush. When the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, it became difficult for them to immigrate. Chinese immigrants who were in America when the act passed had to decide if they wanted to stay in California or return to China and be with their families.
Excellent.
And that's...
Thank you, Aaron. Korean?
For Korean, we had a lot of plantation laborers to work in the Hawaiian pineapple fields and sugarcane fields. But we also had like brides, orphans, students, businessmen, politicians, and professionals, like doctors, lawyers, and professors who came. Immigration for Koreans can be described like in three waves. Like in the old immigration period, they were escaping political turmoil, famine, and there was like a demand for cheap labor in Hawaii. In the intermediate period, the War Bride Act, McCarran and Walter Act, both assisted many refugees to escape the Korean War. And the contemporary period, the Immigration Act abolished previous strict immigration laws and is the main contributing factor until this day for immigration. So where first came to Hawaii, a lot of them settled in California, particularly LA. But during Japanese rule, a lot came to study on the East Coast, like at Princeton, Harvard, Boston University. Again, they came like in three waves. The first was the old wave in 1903 to 1949, where about 9,000 came. The intermediate period from 1950 to 1964, about 15,000 came as immigrants, and then the contemporary, which dates to like the present time, and there's about 1.1 million. And how a lot came by boat, but a lot through laws passed like the Immigration Act, the War Bride Act, the Naturalization Act, McCarran and Walter Act.
Excellent, Justin. Excellent. Cambodian?
I'll read it. It says, the U.S. Census estimates 276,667 Cambodian people, 1.6% of all Asians in the U.S. in 2012. The number of Cambodians admitted in 1996 was 135,000. The percentage of foreign-born Asian American Cambodians compared to non-foreign-born was approximately 65% in 2000 and 50% in 2010. Like most other sub-ethnic groups of Asian American, this suggests that there is a strong indication of growing second-generation U.S.-born children of foreign-born percentage. What economic turmoil in the country of origin, worsened by the U.S., contributed to the Cambodian refugee immigration to the United States? The perceived threat of communism was the main factor for the United States' involvement in the warfare that left nearby countries like Cambodia in social disarray. Cambodians settled in cities such as Long Beach, Fresno, and in Stockton, California. They were also in Providence, Rhode Island, Cleveland, Ohio, as well as Lynn and Lowell in Massachusetts and Seattle. And Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. Cambodians began entering the U.S. during the late 1970s after the Khmer Rouge was overthrown by the Vietnamese troops. How they entered the U.S. states as refugees after the group of Cambodian communists called Khmer Rouge, led by French educated Pol Pot, won a civil war that raged from March 1970 to April 1975 in their home country and proceeded to rule. They fled as many as 2 million. 2 million Cambodians were killed by the new government. Many Cambodians initially entered Thailand, and thousands were permitted to come to the U.S. in the 1980s. The U.S. was forced to act and pass the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Lau?
We wrote that for the WHO, approximately 232,000 Laotians. We couldn't really find exactly where, but we kind of got the US, Hawaii and Pacific West and Thailand. That's where most that we could find, at least in the book, went to. The what we put the Korean and Vietnam Wars, those conditions and the poverty that kind of rose in the areas made them escape or want to, leave said areas. It was around 1975 when we got most of them leaving, and the How refugees from Korea and Vietnam, some floating from the open sea, and were rescued by National Guards or whatever other country that they ended up floating by if they hadn't, died at sea.
All right.
As well as U.S. family sponsors.
Great, Nathan. That's excellent. I'm gonna add to this for you. Okay, a little bit.
Mhm.
Okay, Lao were actually part of the Secret War. Okay, and the Secret War was when the United States actually paid different Lao ethnic groups, including Hmong, to come to fight for the U.S. in proxy. So they were fighting for the U.S. And so some were so Laos and Cambodia are neutral countries, but we had a secret war there where we paid ethnic groups to fight on the behalf of the U.S. And unfortunately, as you know, we lost the war, and the secret war we also lost. And so because of that, people who fought on the side of the U.S. had to leave immediately because of ethnic strife. Okay, so had to leave because of ethnic strife. Okay, because the communists took over. All right, thank you. All right, Hmong. Hmong. Any group who did Hmong?
Oh, we did Hmong.
Go ahead.
Uh, it, are an ethnic group from the mountainous regions of China, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. In 2010, there was an estimated population of 260,073. They began migration southwards towards southwards due to political unrest. I'm sorry. They had American military ties to fight against North Vietnam, and they left refugee camps because of the Refugee Assistance Act of 1975. Around 170,000 Hmong immigrants to to us by the year of 2000. 89% of these immigrants settled California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. 1975, following the United States withdrawal from the Vietnam War, uh, Hmong were targeted for repri- rep-
Reprisals?
reprisals, my bad, because of their support of the U.S. after South Vietnam capital fell to the North Vietnam forces. At risk of severe retaliation from the Lao government, Hmong and other Lat- Lation exiles escaped to Thailand. The Hmong immigrants achieved refugee status largely because of their war efforts on behalf of the Americans, as well as their need to escape the communist regime. Long after the Vietnam War, the U.S. Congress enacted legislation to enable Southeast Asian refugees to come to the United States.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Brian.
you.
Vietnamese.
Okay, so for the Vietnamese and the Hmong, they kind of overlapped a bit.
Mhm.
But for the Hu, we have a large scale of Vietnamese migrated to the US who mainly were military personnel and urban professionals with their families. The second wave of Vietnamese refugees, which were known as Bo people, they were like a big wave after the initial first wave. As for the what, with the help of resettlement, they tended to have low paying, unskilled jobs that provided little training or opportunities for advancement, steadily increasing the number of unemployed single mothers because of the lack of education. For jobs, they were disproportionate in production occupations like assemblers, fabricators, metal workers, plastic workers, inspectors, testers, sorters, and weighers. For where, when they first arrived, the US is the top destination for Vietnamese immigrants, specifically in California, Texas, Washington, and Florida. Other countries include Australia, Canada, and France. For the when, this is where it kind of overlaps, is in 1975 after the Vietnam War, which saw the first wave of 120,000, which and then 2 decades afterwards, we saw a total of 800,000 arriving by sea, which is why they're called boat people. And as for how they arrived, They were considered refugees of war, and they gained a lot of assistance from the US that provided transportation from the countries, housing, and jobs. And like I said, a large number of Vietnamese followed by boat soon after.
Excellent, Mr. Omar. South Indian.
Oops, sorry, I wasn't letting me unmute. So for the Who's, the first South Indian people were males who married Mexican women. There were approximately 200,000 that were indentured laborers. Over 31 million people of Indian birth or descent are part of the Indian diaspora. For the
Diaspora. Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay. For the what? Agriculture working on sugarcane plantations over a span of 5 decades. They also worked as coal miners and railroad workers. They also became the second largest group of international students, where Fresno Central Valley, when 1800s to 2015. How they traveled on East India Company ships to North America. Most have acquired H-1B temporary visas. Also in 1999, India introduced the Person of Indian Origin Card, PIO card, and in 2005, Overseas Citizenship of India, OCI. Both grant practical parity with Indian citizens, but do not permit voting, standing for election, or government employment. That's just a link from migrationpolicy.org, which is more information and like pictures of stuff. So
excellent, thank you.
So for Filipino people, the Who, at first they were agriculture workers, and then from there it started to migrate nurses and some military recruits, as well as workers that work in the canneries and also from that work on ships. They started migrating since the 1960s. Around 150,000 Filipinos nurses have come to the United States, especially after World War II. The what? They were mostly agriculture workers that work here in the United States as sugarcane plantation. The where from the west coast of California to part of Hawaii, Alaska, and Louisiana. And in 2013, 46% of Filipinos in the United States live in California, mostly in Los Angeles County, with the highest concentration. When the first wave started in 1899 due to the U.S. annexation of the Philippines, and the how the Pensionado Act provided funds to Filipino students to study in the U.S. from 1903 to 1936. Around the 1920s, they migrated to the United States because of the demand for agriculture workers. Between 1946 and 1965, there were immigrants that came to the U.S. as wives of the military personnel, and the Lucis-Villar Act increased immigration quota post-war. The Education Exchange Act of 1946 was an important source of migration to the U.S. Mostly migrants post-1965 were skilled professionals.
All right, excellent, everyone. We don't have time for Indonesian Thailand. So the group, you guys are going to go up next class. I'm going to stop the recording right now.